Welcome to Tabletop Tommies, Ep.7. I'm Jonny.
And I'm Phil.
And today we're going to be talking about the British and Commonwealth Army book, specifically going through what units we like, what units we think are quite good. We're probably not going to dwell on the ones that other people have spoken about at great detail about being good ones. It's more going to be a focus on the ones that we like, either because they're fun, they're thematic, or they do fill a bit of a niche that isn't filled elsewhere. I think it would be good before we started, though, to sort of confine the scopes of the episode a bit by saying, what aren't we going to talk about, Phil?
Yeah, that makes sense, because if you're talking about the British and the Commonwealth, it's so vast and so many possible units. So we're going to be primarily focusing on what you can take for a Great Britain platoon. There might be some reference to some units, such as Canadians, that can be taken in a generic British platoon. We're not going to be talking about Commonwealth national characteristics. We're not going to talk about the Canadian Army as its own thing. We're not going to talk about the Australian Army as its own thing. That will appear down the line.
Yeah, I think they are worthy of episodes in their own right, so I think it would do them a disservice to squeeze them into this one. It is, on that note about being so vast, though, it is one of the criticisms often levelled that the British have access to everything, and I think that is because the Empire was so vast.
Mm-hmm.
The population of the world in 1939 was about 2.3 billion people, according to estimates. And the British Empire was about, I think, 550 million people. So over 20% of the world's population were living in the British Empire at the start of the war. As a game, they've decided to put most of it in one book. So, of course, if you make that one faction, that's a huge amount of stuff to try and represent.
Mm-hmm.
But now we've sort of defined what we're going to be talking about. Shall we just get on and talk about it then?
Yeah, let's just crack through
it. So let's start where every army book starts, in the national characteristics section.
Mm-hmm.
Vengeance is one we talked about in episode 2.
Yep.
So that one, I think everyone is aware. We like lose a pin if you're within 12 inches on a 4+. We'll not dwell too much on that one. But what are some of the other ones you like to run, Phil?
Yeah, so there's five possible national characteristics that you can take, and ignoring the Commonwealth options. So Vengeance is one of them. The other four, then, you've got Rapid Fire, which gives you an extra shot for every 3 riflemen, providing they are regular or veteran infantry units. I never take this one, to be fair.
No, rarely seen. It's only tends to be newer players running sort of maximum size regular rifleman squads, which tends to fall out of fashion as you get more experienced, I find.
Yeah. And then the other 3 all pretty much relate to close assaults. You're going to take them for close assault purposes. So the first one is Up and Atom. If you've got this rule, then any order given to make an assault is automatically treated as having been passed. So you'll see this particularly in things like, say, Gurkha lists, where you're basically ignoring pins. So if you need to make that charge, you give them a run order, declare it's an assault, they've automatically passed.
Yeah, I've seen that one used in a different way as well, because obviously it's super useful to get your Gurkhas in without having to take a test, because if people are going to try and pin them before they get in.
Yeah.
But I've also seen it used a bit cheekily, where if you've got something like an inexperienced mortar on the back lines and you're playing something like sectors, sometimes you can up and atom that mortar and it'll run directly towards the enemy, won't it?
Well, you can't because that particular example, the unit's inexperienced. It only applies to regular or vets, but the principle is true. You often hear this being called the British Banzai.
Yeah.
The only difference between this and the Banzai rule for the Japanese is that you don't have to charge the closest visible unit. You can just automatically assault, in inverted commas. So you're running at a unit, doesn't need to be the closest visible one.
It does have to be visible, though.
It's got to be visible, yeah, because it's an assault, but it doesn't have to be the closest one.
That's good. So yeah, that is better than the Banzai, and it would be one that you could certainly, not always, but there'll be times when you could use that to effect, just to move a unit that's got too many pins to act in the traditional way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep, next one.
So next one is Blood-curdling charge. So for this one, if your British Army has this national characteristic, then if you declare a charge, the opponent cannot react to that charge in the way that you can when an assault is declared. So obviously, when an assault is declared, if the unit you're charging is between 6 and 12 inches and hasn't activated already this turn, it's allowed to do a reaction fire. with blood curdling charge, it isn't allowed to do a reaction fire. So it can be quite useful if you want to be, running in over 6 inches, under 12 inches. Your enemy, your opponent, hasn't used that unit this turn. You're using blood curdling charge, so they're not getting that chance to fire back. It is worth noting, though, that if the unit you're charging is on ambush, this rule doesn't apply because ambush is dealt with separately.
Yeah, because then they're not reacting to you. They're ambushing you because you're moving in their line of sight.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that's one that I used to see quite a lot with people running Gurkhas, but I haven't seen it in a while because I tend to see people more running either up and at them or the next one you're going to talk about.
Yeah, so the final one then is tough as boots, and it's the same principle as rapid fire, albeit for close assault. So for tough as boots, for every 3 men who are regular or veteran in a unit, you get an additional extra die. So if you've got a 4-man unit, you're rolling 4 dice for the men plus 1 because you've got over 3 men in this instance.
So it's basically rapid fire, but for close quarters.
Yeah, that's the better way of explaining it. Thank you.
I have just discovered something there. I always thought it was tough as old boots.
No, it's tough as boots. Yeah.
Yeah, I've just realised I've been wrong. The entire time I've been playing Bolt Action, I think I've been calling the tough as old boots.
Yeah, tough as boots.
Well, there you go. You learn something new every day.
And again, you can see this again in like close assault forces. So, if you're talking about Gurkhas or commandos or that sort of thing, obviously the trick here is to run your units at least divisible by 3. So, 6 or more. Personally, I'd run them at 7, for example, or 8, because that allows you to take 1 or 2 casualties and you're still getting that extra bonus for every 3 men left in that assault. Yeah,
this is what I'm starting to see more with Gurkhas. It used to be that people used to do the blood curdling charge. That was the one that I used to see most commonly. Then at the moment, I'd say up and at 'em's probably the most common one because I think people realised the Gurkhas actually didn't take that many wounds being shot at in the reaction fire. And I think now some players are realising that actually with them being veteran, a lot of the time they would have passed the order test anyway. And I have started to see a few people starting to use tough as boots as their national characteristics. So I think that could be coming into fashion, as it were.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Yeah.
There are other national characteristics. I know they get a free forward artillery observer.
Yep.
Which is very nice. When you run yours, do you run him on his own because he's free? Do you give him 1 man for the 10 points so that he's a small team and now he's more likely to survive and take an objective? Or do you go all out and take him as a 3-man? So he loses a small team bonus, but now if they've got SMGs, that's 6 shots. He's actually quite a useful little unit in the shooting phase.
I don't think I've ever taken it as a 3-man. At the moment, more often than not, I take it as a single man because I'm spending those 10 points for that additional man elsewhere. I have in the past, and maybe if I was running, not trying to optimize my list and being totally, squeezing every point out of it, I might run it as a 2-man for that reason that it's still a small team. Once he's called in his artillery fire, a little 2-man team is going to be useful maybe for taking an objective or contesting an objective. But at the moment, the last couple of months or so, it's basically been a single man on his own.
Yeah, I've run them as all 3, and it very much, like what we discussed in the last episode, it depends entirely what the rest of the army is. Because if it's single platoon and I don't have many infantry, I have been known to take it as a 3-man. Just so it's like having a very small additional infantry squad. But equally, I've done like you say, if I was trying to squeeze lots of other toys in, I have just run him on his own.
Yeah.
And so I've tried all 3 of them, and I have to say, I don't think one particular build for that is better than another. It just depends on what else is in your army.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely,
yeah. Brilliant. And the other characteristic is the prep bombardment one, isn't it? Where you get, instead of rolling 1 dice against each unit on prep bombardment, you roll 2.
Yeah.
And then, do you pick the highest?
Yeah, you get to, it says you choose the best results, but basically you're picking the highest, aren't you? So
yeah, so you can't go soft on your opponent. You have to take the worst.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Is that all of their national characteristics?
Yeah, for the core British list, yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. So in that case, I think, shall we move on to officers? Now, I did think officers would be a really quick one and would just say, take a second lieutenant, it's the way to go. And then I realised, speaking to you before we recorded, that there is actually some fun to be had when you're choosing your officer for the Brits. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, in very niche circumstances. So very broadly speaking, I'll take a second lieutenant. If I'm maximizing my points, I'll take an inexperienced one. If I'm maybe being a little bit more historical, thematic, whatever, it will be a regular, possibly a vet, depending on the force.
Ooh.
Yeah, I know, controversial. Couple of things just to flag up. So from the Soft Underbelly book, you can take a Highland officer. So Highland officer was added in the Soft Underbelly book. It's a veteran officer. The core officer costs exactly the same as what a normal veteran officer costs from the Armies of Great Britain. The interesting thing with the Highland officer is you can add a bagpiper. So,
Oh, nice.
So for 33 points, you can add a bagpiper, and it effectively makes the platoon a Highland platoon. Now, what this means is that providing the bagpiper is alive, regular and veteran infantry sections in the platoon may re-roll failed morale checks. It doesn't apply to FUBAR rolls, but any other role it does. I just think it's quite a little cool thing. And given what we talked about in the previous episode about models and stuff I like, there are a few manufacturers out there that make Highlander, so British Highlander models. And I have seen a couple of really nice kilted bagpipers, which I think would be quite cool to stick into the army and have as an option. So the bagpiper from the Soft Underbelly. So the Highland officer is legal. It's allowed in a generic platoon, and then as an option with that, you can add that bagpiper.
So are there Scottish infantry, jumping ahead to the infantry section, are there Scottish infantry, or does the bagpiper make normal infantry Scottish by his presence?
So there isn't, to my knowledge, and I'm 99% sure of this, there isn't a Scottish unit. There is an Irish unit, and there's Canadians and that sort of stuff. There isn't a Scottish unit. Effectively, what you do is you buy a Highland officer, who is, for all intents and purposes, the same as a non-Highland officer. You then add the bagpiper, and then that makes it a Highland platoon. So your generic British regular infantry squad is now a Scottish Highlander squad.
One thing I've noticed, looking at that, is their special rule. That last bit about FUBAR doesn't make sense, because when you fail a morale check, you can't FUBAR. You just be removed. Because FUBAR only happens on order tests, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so the bagpiper allows you to re-roll failed morale checks. The sentence afterwards in the Underbelly book that says FUBAR rolls cannot be re-rolled is irrelevant, because a FUBAR is off an order check, not morale check. What one for the errata?
I mean, at least with that particular mistake, it doesn't make a difference, because you're just going to remove them when they fail the test. I suppose it could lead to confusion when newer players do a friendly fire before they remove their squad.
Yeah.
Which would be a bit of a shame. But generally your experienced players are just going to ignore that.
Yeah.
Right, so that's that one done. Anything else exciting in the officer slot for the Brits?
Yes. So the one that I really enjoy, and if you listen to the previous episode where I talked about commandos, so in the D-Day British and Canadian sectors book, there's an entire commando force with all the different options. So up until this point with the books, effectively you were taking a commandos as a unit that you're putting into a British platoon. With the D-Day and Canadian sector book, they allowed you to, or they gave you the option to run a pure commando list. The reason I'm flagging this up is if you take a late war Royal Marine Commando officer, so quite specific, it's late war and it's Royal Marines rather than just commandos. You pay your normal points for your officer, which is 66 points for a veteran officer. The reason why it's 66 is it's +1 because it's a tough fighter. But what you can do is add up to 5 additional men. So normally with an officer, you can add up to 2 additional men. With the commando, late war commando Royal Marine officer, you can add up to 5. And you're only paying 14 points for this. And obviously it's armed as modelled. So what I've done here is to run a 6-man SMG squad with a second lieutenant. So I'm paying my 66 points for my veteran commando second lieutenant. I'm paying 14 points per additional man, 5 of them, and I don't have to pay the extra points for the SMGs because they're armed as modelled. What this creates is basically a little 6-man, pretty strong, to be fair, 6-man veteran, tough fighter, SMG armed unit. So my officer becomes effectively another squad.
Oh yeah, and this is exactly what I was saying about the forward artillery observer, where I'm running them as a 3-man to have an extra infantry squad. This is exactly that, but better.
Yes,
I would say.
It isn't. It's not permitted though in a generic platoon. So before anybody gets excited and starts looking into it, you can only do it in the commando selector, and it can only be the late war Royal Marine commando selector. But for all you commando players out there, if you're running them as Royal Marines, it's definitely worth looking at.
I was going to ask you if it's available in the generic, and it's a shame that it's not. And the other one that I think is a shame that's not in the generic, because I would run it all day long, is the heavy weapons officer.
Yes.
Who's in the same book. I think the entry's directly underneath, where very similar idea, except he's got the trained gunner rule that the US have a similar officer, which is why I'm aware of it, where it allows him to recrew artillery pieces, which is brilliant if you're running artillery, especially like the British 25-pounders.
Yeah, I would just add, talking about its availability, if you look on Easy Army, it does appear that both those units we just mentioned, the Royal Marine Commando Lieutenant and the Heavy Weapons Lieutenant, are available. They're not. So if you don't have the book and you're just running off Easy Army, unfortunately they aren't available. They're only applicable to the selectors in the British and Canadian D-Day book.
Yeah, or specific TOs. If you're trying to run it at a tournament, it may be that the tournament organizer might allow it, but obviously that's tournament specific. So yeah, it might be worth us putting because we made a generic unit sheet, didn't we?
We did, yes. Yep.
On that note about, obviously Easy Army quite often goes for completeness over accuracy sometimes, like that example there. And so it might be worth, I might put the link in the description for that sheet.
Yeah.
Just because obviously it costs us nothing to put it there, and if it helps one person, I think that's worth doing.
Yeah, I'd agree, yeah.
So I was expecting the officer section to take all of 2 minutes. Is there anything else that I missed in there?
So the only thing I'm just going to chuck in, just to make it longer than 2 minutes, is the intelligence officer. And I'll let you talk about, what it does. But the reason for adding it is that you can create a normal officer, a 3-man officer team. You can make it a 4-man team by adding an intelligence officer, and you're kind of moving towards that 6-man commando officers team I just mentioned.
Yeah, I really like the intelligence officers. They aren't one for every single list, so they're not an auto-include for me. But if I have points left, say, for example, we're going to play a single platoon. Sometimes I've filled all the slots I want, and I've got sort of 30-ish points lying round. The intelligence officer is both quite a fun one, because what he does is, at the start of a turn, so any game turn, you can roll a dice using your intelligence officer, and on a 4-up, you get to choose the first die that's pulled from the bag. So obviously you'd probably be choosing your own. If it's a veteran intelligence officer, say it is one of the commando intelligence officers, then that's going to give you +1 to that roll. So on a 3-up, you get to choose the first die out of the bag. And on a inexperienced intelligence officer, it's -1. So that's only on a 5-up. So obviously if it comes off, he's worth it every time. But if you take him inexperienced, it may be that the points aren't as worth it because there's a smaller chance of it happening compared to the regular, the veteran. The place I've used them is when I play tested the Budapest Recce platoon, because I said in the last episode I was running it very much mounted, go as fast as possible. I put it in that one because I knew that there'd be a time that I risked my trucks, and that works about 2/3 of the time. It works every time. Because on a 3-up I get to choose the first dice, which means the truck that I put in the middle of the table that's just really exposed, well, it gets to activate first, so it's fine. But of course what it means is 1/3 of the time it goes badly. You don't get to pull the first dice, you don't get to choose the first dice pulled, but there's still a chance yours comes out randomly anyway. And so actually you've got 2 chances there to get the first dice. So I do like the intelligence officer, but not an auto-include would be my summary.
Okay.
Anything else in the HQ section of note?
No, that's all from me.
Yeah, I think we'll mention the fact they've got the usual medic, chaplain, forward air observer. There is also the naval observer who is really strong.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point when he was first released, he was an autoclude for a lot of people because he was really powerful, but the FAQ increased his price.
Mm-hmm.
And so you now very rarely see him. And he was banned from tournaments, from a lot of tournaments, because he was a very cheap, very powerful unit for a while there. Now, I think if you didn't ban him, you probably still wouldn't see him that often.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought worth mentioning that one, just in case someone is going from the original D-Day book that he's listed in and hadn't seen the FAQ entry yet.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point.
Brilliant. So I think that's HQ wrapped up. Shall we move on to infantry, the core of the army?
Yeah, so I wasn't going to go through all the options because, it's fairly standard in terms of inexperienced regular vets. You get paratroopers that have stubborn. I was just going to highlight 3 infantry units. Two are from the main book, and then one is from one of the campaign books.
Yep.
So the first one I wanted to highlight was the commandos from the main book. So it's 14 points. You're getting a veteran infantryman, which has tough fighter. So you're paying 1 point for tough fighter. This is definitely worth looking at. And if you do want to add SMGs, you're only paying 2 extra points rather than 3 because you've already paid that 1 point for the tough fighter, which is part of their core profile. The reason I'm mentioning it is not to add the SMGs. It's actually to run it as a rifle squad, albeit with tough fighter. And what I find quite useful with these guys is you can use them to hold objectives in terms of being a veteran squad. The fact they've got tough fighter will hopefully put your opponent off from assaulting them unless they've got a very strong assault unit coming up against the commandos.
Yeah, I like this squad. I run this squad when I'm not running Gurkhas because it's finding a squad where you can have all SMGs is often quite rare in a lot of armies because they're reserved weapons for specialist squads or for like NCOs, etc. And so I'm running them just because I like to run 5-man squads with 5 SMGs. One thing to note though is usually because they've got the behind enemy lines where they ignore the -1 if they're outflanking to come on the table. Normally squads do pay a point for that. And so actually and I don't think that ability is worth a point if I'm honest, because outflanking on foot I find tends to be a bit of a gamble, because if you choose the wrong flank you're not fast enough to correct that mistake in turn 4. And so I actually don't think that ability is worth a point, but it is worth noting that other units are paying a point for that ability, which means that actually compared to those units, this unit is 1 point per model cheaper. So, but as I say, it doesn't really affect me because I tend not to outflank them. I'm just running them as 5 veterans with 5 SMGs.
Sure. Yeah. The other thing just to note with the commandos, and we're going to detour slightly into a theatre selector. So in the Battle of the Bulge campaign book, it added the FFI, which is the French resistance section. If you take a Normandy selector as either an American or a British player, you can add up to 2 of these FFI squads, which are basically inexperienced green 10-man squads. The reason why I mention this is what I've done is if I'm running a commando force, not using the commando selector from the British and Canadian D-Day book, but using the Normandy selector from the Armies of Great Britain book, because it's a vet-heavy list, I'm often low on my order dice. So what I might do, and I have done successfully, is add a couple of those FFI squads in, which allows me to have a bunch of commandos with tough fighters, with or without SMGs, all that sort of stuff. And also I get 2 pretty cheap units of inexperienced green troops that I can use to hold objectives or hang back or what have you. That's
a great tip. It is ironic after we said we were going to limit ourselves very strictly to the British and not include the Canadians and everyone, to bring up a French squad though.
Well, I just did, so yeah.
Yeah, but great tip though, nonetheless. What was the second squad you wanted to mention?
So second squad is also from the Armies of Great Britain, and it's the Chindits. And I'm going to talk about LMGs. which is controversial because, are they overcosted? Yes, they are, etc. The reason for mentioning the Chindits is they have the fire and maneuver special rule that the US have for free.
Ooh.
But the US rule only applies to rifles, doesn't it? It doesn't apply to LMGs.
And BARs, which
BARs.
makes... the reason I didn't ooh there is I just saw where you were going with the point. Yeah, the Americans, it's rifles and BARs, which makes light machine guns incredibly overcosted because 2 BARs are 10 points and a light machine gun is 20, but you're getting the movement penalty with the Americans.
Yeah.
But I've got a feeling you're about to tell me something exciting with the Chindits.
So with the Chindits, they get fire and maneuver, and it applies to them as a unit rather than the weapons they are armed with. So the reason for saying this is that you can run a 6-7 man Chindit section, all vets, with an LMG. It is expensive, but you're then getting a brilliant skirmish unit because you're not getting a penalty for fire and maneuver. You're getting the longer range because you've got an LMG. They're pretty hardy because they're vets as well. It's not something you see competitively because of points efficiency and that kind of thing. But it is worth considering. They also get the commando rule behind enemy lines, so they don't suffer the -1 to outflank. So something I have done, and I've had it done to me and seen it done as well, is an outflanking Chindit unit with an LMG. So it's testing on a 10 to come on the board because it doesn't get the -1 and it's a vet. It's got a longer reach because it's got an LMG, and it's not getting a penalty for fire and maneuver.
Yeah, I've just had a look. They're 2 points more than a normal veteran, aren't they?
They are, because you're paying 1 point for behind enemy lines and 1 point for fire and maneuver.
That's what I thought. So, funnily, there's an example of a squad who are paying for the behind enemy lines, where the commandos aren't.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sounds like one that it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But because light machine guns are quite expensive and because you're paying 2 points a model to fire and maneuver, it's not going to be one I'm going to automatically include. I'm going to include it when I'm doing a thematic army where the Chindits fit nicely, because it does make them very playable, being able to move the light machine gun and then shoot it without penalty.
Yeah, it's very much one for, it's a bit of fun. It fits a nice theme, that kind of thing. You're not going to do it if you're looking at maximal points efficiency and effectiveness and taking a truly competitive list.
Yeah, that's a fun unit though.
Yeah.
It's a good one to highlight. And what was your third unit you wanted to highlight?
So my third one, which is Canadian, it's the Royal Canadian Engineer Section, MTA, so the Mediterranean Theatre of Operations. So with the British, there's various different engineer sections across different books. You've got, there's one in Battle of France, there's one in Western Desert, there's this one in Soft Underbelly. I think there's one in one of the D-Day books as well. This is the one I take. Yeah, there's one in the D-Day book, yeah. This is the one that I take for a number of reasons. It can be regular or vet at the standard 10 points or 13 points. You can have up to 5 men armed with SMGs, which you can't do with some of the other options from the different books. Because they're Canadian, they don't get the national rule that the rest of your army gets. Instead, they get tough as boots. So that one squad gets tough as boots. And you can also make them stubborn for 1 point per model. So something I'll often do, this is the standard tactic of stick an engineer team with a flamethrower in a Bren. If I'm doing that, I'll run it as a Canadian engineer unit. I may often take them stubborn, so regular stubborn, or even vet stubborn. And because they've got tough as old boots, they are also slightly more survivable if they get assaulted because they're rolling that extra dice for having 3 or more men.
Yeah, this is one that I've run. Because I like vengeance, because I like to run flamethrowers and get in people's faces and things. And it did mildly annoy me not having vengeance on the unit with the flamethrower.
Yeah.
Because that's the unit that's going to be within 12. Or, as we discussed episode 2, it's the one where I'd like to measure to see if I am within 12.
Yeah.
To do my vengeance roll.
Yeah.
And actually, I think with the Canadian ones, running them as an SMG squad, as you mentioned there, would be a really good shout. To have, because you're getting that extra attack. They can have a lot of SMGs. Yep. You could make them stubborn. I think that would be really good, actually. The one that I like is the one in the Battle of France. Similar sort of idea where you can take it. You can actually take that one inexperienced as well. But you can take a regular and veteran. Can have the flamethrower. It can only have the one submachine gun on the NCO because it's early war. And you can actually take it as airborne Royal Engineers as well. If they're veteran, you can pay an extra point to make them stubborn. So you've got that option still. They do get the national characteristic of the rest of your force, which I like. But the only issue with the one in Battle of France is you can only have one per reinforced platoon. Which means that if you do want to run, say, 2 flamethrowers, you're only going to be able to use one of them. And I suppose early war, it does kind of fit the theme that this is an early war unit. In the early war list, you might only have one flamethrower, naturally.
Yeah, whereas with the Canadians, as in a generic platoon, there's no limit. So if you really wanted to, you could run 5 engineers in a generic platoon if they were the Canadian option.
Yeah, which would be fun. And I imagine there's probably a case there as well where there's another national characteristic that would be beneficial to the rest of your army while you're running that entirely as tough as boots. Yeah, I think before we leave the infantry section, the one that got brought up last time, and I don't want to talk about the benefits of the unit too much, but I did say I was going to talk about the Gurkha paratroopers and why they're undercosted quite severely. So for me, the reason that they're so severely undercosted, they're paying, like the Chindits, they're paying 2 points a model. So they're 75 points for 5 veterans rather than 65. But for those 2 points, you get Scary Blighters, which is the one where your opponent halves the number of attacks made against the Gurkhas in close quarters. You get Stubborn, so that's a 1 point upgrade. And you get Tough Fighter. So that's 3 special rules you've got for your 2 points already. And then, much like how we were saying with the Commandos, where because they've got Tough Fighter already, they've reduced the price of the submachine guns. They've actually reduced the price of submachine guns on the Paragurkhas to 1 point. So for the same price as the Commandos, who have behind enemy lines and SMGs, you can have, for the same 80 points, you can have 5 Gurkhas with 5 SMGs, but you're also getting Scary Blighters and Stubborn. So that's the reason why basically they're a bit of an auto-include for most people at a competitive tournament, obviously.
Yeah, at a competitive tournament. If you rock up to a friendly local gaming store 3-game event and you've got a bunch of Gurkha Paras, people might think you are that guy, in inverted commas. Yeah,
100%. I mean, I think what they should be paying is they should be paying 75 points for Scary Blighter and Stubborn. Tough Fighter should mean an extra point per model. So the 5 men, in my opinion, should be 80 points. And then you could give them a 1 point reduction on the SMG still. That's fine because they've already got the Tough Fighter. But then now it's 90 points for your 5 men, which would be 18 points a model. I think at that price, they're fair. You'd still see them often enough because they're not overpriced there. But I think they wouldn't be the auto-include they currently are.
And that works in terms of 1 point per extra characteristic. And then that 2 rather than 3 points for the SMGs because they've already got Tough Fighters and you've already paid that additional point. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, what I'm saying effectively is that I think with SMGs they're 2 points cheaper than they should be. So with the SMGs, you're currently paying 16 points a model, whereas I think you should be paying 18 points. Actually, what I've just realised saying that is a normal veteran with an SMG is 16 points. So you're getting all of your special rules for free, and that, I think, highlights just how undercosted they are. So I don't think we need to labour that point anymore. I think most people who've been playing for 5 minutes are fully aware that Gurkha paratroops are undercosted. But I just wanted to really spell it out for anyone who's heard it because it's banded around so much, but hasn't sort of looked at the specifics as to why people are saying they're cheaper than they should be.
Yeah, sure.
I don't think there's anything else in the infantry section that caught my eye. I mean, there's a lot in there, so I imagine there's quite a lot of fun stuff that I've overlooked. But was there anything else you thought was worth highlighting before we moved on?
Not for worth highlighting, no.
No, I have just actually noticed that there is a commando intelligence section, and this is available for a couple of the armies, so it'll probably come up again later. But essentially what that is, it's an infantry squad, and then you have the intelligence officer in that infantry squad, rather than having to attach him to your officer. It does mean your infantry squad's slightly more expensive, so the commando one, which again I think is theatre selector only rather than generic, that's 99 points. But for those 99 points you're getting 5 men, and one of them is the officer who can, on a 3+, let you choose the first dice out of the bag. So it's just another way to run them, basically, if you wanted to have the intelligence officer, but you didn't want to attach him to your officer because you had something planned for him. Like maybe he was going to go in the Jeep with your flamethrower team on his own, so you couldn't afford to attach the intelligence officer to him. So I think that was about it from me for infantry. So I think it's worth moving on to the team weapons.
Yep.
Feel free to interrupt if another infantry squad springs to mind.
No.
Machine gun team, we talked about it briefly in the last one. I don't think it's worth dwelling on. I think you're going to include it if you have a reason to, but generally not a competitive unit. Heavy mortar, or medium mortar, or light mortar for you? Which one are you going to go for, sir?
So I tend to go for a medium mortar simply because rather than going for the heavy. And the reason is that I'm trying to put the pins on and I'm trying to save points, and I'm not banking on hitting it in the way that with a heavy mortar, when I hit it, the unit's going to go. Yeah.
I think we're agreed that the light mortar, the blaster's too small to make it a really dangerous weapon, so it's not generally worth the points unless it's thematic, I find. However, I do disagree, and I think the heavy is better because it's only at inexperienced. I think if you're running them as regular veteran, the medium mortar is probably more cost efficient, but inexperienced, it's only 11 points more. It's 46 points for a heavy mortar, and so you're taking a unit for the cost of 11 points. You're taking a unit that that when it hits, it slows the opponent's unit down, and you've turned it into a unit where if it hits, it removes that unit from the table potentially. And so I think for the 11 points, it's worth it, especially because you get one more man. And so that could be the difference between sort of the morale check or not, or it could be the difference between winning at close quarters and losing at close quarters if it really goes bad.
Yeah, I was looking at it from why I'm taking the mortar, which is generally speaking to counter battery, and more often than not, it's my mortar going up against their artillery, or maybe my mortar going up against their mortar, but hopefully with snipers and other things, I might have taken out the mortars already. And the idea being that if, with a 2-inch 2-inch template from the medium mortar, I'm hoping I'm going to get 2 or 3 guys, depending on how fast spaced they are, under that template. I'm hoping I'm going to kill a couple of them. D3 pins, it's going to force a morale check. That should, so a medium mortar that hits, kills a couple of guys with some pins, that should get rid of that unit rather than needing to rely on the heavy mortar. Where the heavy mortar, I think, comes into its own is if you're landing hits on a veteran unit or a big infantry squad. But I tend to not fire my mortars at things that are going to move like an infantry squad. I'm targeting the static stuff, like my opponent's artillery and all their mortar.
Yeah, the reason I'm running that heavy is, so if I'm coming up against your medium mortar, I'm going to put my men 1 inch apart basically in as close to a line as I can, so that if your medium mortar hits, it gets 2 men. Now, what that means is there's a 1 in 6 chance you don't kill one of them, which means I don't have to take a morale check. There's also a chance that I hadn't reacted yet and I chose to go down, which means you only get to kill one of them, which means a no morale check. So that's sort of the defensive reason why I often take a heavy mortar. And the offensive reason that I often take one is I'll sometimes use it as a bit of an anti-tank weapon. Where if it's sort of a bit of a lumbering tank, especially if it's something that happens to be slow, then I will try a mortar shot on it sometimes, because if you do get the hit, even if you don't get the pen, you'll get the D3 pins. And so if you roll those 3 pins, brilliant. And now, if someone does really bring something lumbering like an armor 10 tank, the heavy mortar can still hurt it, so it will still definitely pin it. Whereas the medium, if it's a regular armor 10 tank, there's a 50-50 shot, it just ignores the pins. And so, I mean, that's a very much an edge case. But because really what I'm hoping for if my heavy mortar hits is to wreck the tank, set it on fire or something.
It's also quite difficult. The larger tanks, which is basically what your armor value 10 tanks are going to be, and even armor 9 to be fair, because you've got to clear the footprint of the vehicle by 2 inches to clear a successful ranging in. So it actually can become impossible for a tank to get out of that ranged in mortar shot, because unless they're running, they're not able to do it because of the footprint, and they're needing to clear the 2 inches of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where actually either mortar, if it can do pins to the tank automatically, what I really like is then there's a chance that it fails its test and then it either reverses at half rate and then it's still within 2 inches of where it was, or if there's nothing that can see, it just goes down. Which means that if it's pinned already and they risk doing the auto test, there's a good chance you get to just keep applying the pins for the rest of the game, basically.
Even though it's crawling back at that 4.5 inches.
Yeah, and it's one of the times where your tactics change slightly, because normally you want to fire your mortar as early as possible. But if you've got a tank and you've had 2 turns putting pins on it, so let's say it's on like 5 pins, rather than doing your mortar at the very beginning, you know that your opponent is, if they take the auto test, there's a good chance they'll fail, so they'll probably rally. Either way, they're still going to be ranged in. And so that's a case where actually, if I can, I'll hold the mortar back until the very last dice of the turn, hoping that they've rallied, and then I can just do another hit and put the pins back on.
Yeah.
And so, whereas normally you're trying to get your artillery and stuff off as early as possible in the round, that's a rare case where you want to do it as late as possible.
Yeah, that's a good tip, man.
So, other team weapons, we've got a sniper team. The sniper does have pistols. That's the only thing that I would note with that. Flamethrower team, I would like to make a stop at the flamethrower team to say that controversially I never take them. Strong dislike from me for this flamethrower team, and it's because it's 2 men, so it's easy to kill anyway. And then of course there's a 1 in 6 chance every time you shoot them that you lose an auto dice. It's really not the vehicle for a flamethrower, in my opinion. If I'm going to take a flamethrower, I'm going to put it in a squad.
Yeah,
I have run flamethrower teams. Usually it's in armies where they don't have access to engineers. So there's a Finnish army that I've run before where I wanted a flamethrower just because I needed something that could finish squads off. And so I put a flamethrower team in. But generally, unless I can see a very specific case for it because I don't have something like it, I won't include a flamethrower team. But I know you run them quite a lot.
Yeah, and having just listened to you, I'm now thinking I shouldn't. The reason I run them is it's that anti-vehicle option. So it's a flamethrower in a Jeep. I'm not using it to push up and take out infantry. I'm using it as a counter to a vehicle. It's almost a bit like of an insurance in terms of if my own vehicle or, say, my engineer squad or my artillery has been knocked out, it's that just in case. I have started to move away from them, to be fair, in the last couple of months.
Yeah. 2 points on that, actually. The way you use that there, where you're putting it in a Jeep and then maybe putting it in outflank, is exactly what I think you should be doing with it, because that's when I've done that, that's how I've run it, because you're using it less as an actual weapon and more like how we talked about the Piat in the list building episode, where you're using it to basically herd your opponent's units away from the edge of the table. And so if you've got your Gurkhas in the middle, they're now between a bit of a rock and a hard place, because do I want to go near the flank where the flamethrower could come in, or do I want to go near the Gurkhas? That's a good use case to try and shepherd units towards your Gurkhas.
Okay, so my other thing with the flamethrower is using it to protect an objective. So if you sit it in sight of an objective, behind some hard cover, or maybe behind some dense terrain, depending on where the objective is, it's a very, very good way of protecting that objective, because you're effectively saying to your opponent, come and get this objective, but there's a flamethrower sat there 6 inches away, maybe on ambush. Are you willing to risk it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say that it would be a good one to hold an objective as well, because small team, in ambush, you try to charge it, it's going to flame you. If it goes down, it's a small team, in cover, down, it's going to be super sixes. But the fact that it might delete itself and it's only 2 men means that I tend not to use it to actually hold the objective. But I think your idea is a really good one there. The other point I was going to say about the flamethrower is something that Mike of the WTC Team England said to me, which was that one of the things he considers when he's shooting his flamethrower is when it starts getting pins, if it's hitting on a 6, he actually won't use it because the chances of it hitting are the same as the chance of it running out of fuel. And so what he said was, at that point, he doesn't think it's worth it a lot of the time to use the flamethrower, and he'll actually not fire it and will rally or do something else instead. And I thought that was quite an interesting way to look at it. And it's certainly something that has stuck with me, more so because obviously I'm not running the flamethrower team, but for the flamethrowers in squads and also on vehicles, it is something that I consider quite a lot when I'm deciding, am I going to fire my flamethrower or not? So the next team is the boys anti-tank rifle, or the Piat in the anti-tank slot. So there's one other option, which is the Blacker Bombard team. Not one you see the Blacker Bombard, though. Have you ever seen one?
No, I've never taken it nor seen it, no.
No, it's an interesting one because it's a bit like a light howitzer, but with a 24-inch range, isn't it? But it can't, I don't believe, it can't do indirect.
There's a Soviet one like that, isn't there? I can't remember the name of it, but there's a Soviet one, anti-tank weapon that's very similar. Yeah,
when we get to the US, there's also the recoilless rifles have a similar sort of thing going on. But yeah, this one's a spigot motor, I believe, much like the Piat. It would be one that I'd experiment with, actually, looking at it, because it's only 40 points regular, and you're getting a 2-inch template at 24 inches.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think? Would you try one out?
Yeah, I'm game to try it, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if there's a model in existence for it.
I think, isn't there some of the Home Guards at BEF ones?
Yes. I think you're absolutely right, because I think this one does feature quite predominantly in the Sea Lion book.
Yeah, and it was around Dunkirk as well, wasn't it? It's that sort of time.
Yeah. I'm actually quite interested in that one now. I think when we're not recording, I'm going to come back to that one and just think about it a bit more. The one that I like is the anti-tank rifle team.
Yeah.
I always take it veteran if I take it, because I think for the 9 points, the survivability bonus, the chances of actually getting to shoot, and additionally, one of the things that's often overlooked is with team weapons, when you lose your assistant and you're down to one man, you count as not having an NCO in the same way as an infantry squad. So you're at -1 morale, which means that if you're regular, you take 1 pin, you lose your assistant, you're actually testing at -2, so you're testing at a 7, whereas the veteran's testing at an 8. For prep bombardment as well, having the veteran extra morale can be really beneficial. So I do tend to run this because I really like it for a reasonably cheap order dice that is still quite effective, because not only does it often kill trucks and soft skins, it also is very good at just keeping them away from wherever you don't want them to be. Yeah. Do you run this one a lot?
Yeah, I do. I do take an anti-tank rifle, a lot.
Regular, inexperienced veteran?
Definitely not inexperienced. So normally regular, but yeah, I take the point about why you would take it as a veteran. Yeah.
Yeah, I do like the small teams in the veteran. And again, if I'm running a Piat, if I've got the points, I'll do it. The Piat, it's like a poor man's bazooka, basically, isn't it?
Yeah. I've only taken it when I've had to. So, for example, so my commando list, late war commandos, you can't take an anti-tank rifle. So, if I want to take some form of anti-tank, especially if I'm running them purely as infantry, I'm pretty much limited to flamethrower and a Piat. I have done the classic: put the Piat in the Jeep, rush the Jeep up behind the tank, shoot the Piat from point blank, pop goes the tank. So I have done it, but more often than not, it doesn't do it.
Yeah, I have run a Piat, and actually I quite like them. I like them as a deterrent, and every now and then you kill a tank, and it goes off nicely. Yeah, so it is one, when we talk about transports, it's one of the reasons that I've run the Piat is when I run an army where I'm spending a lot on transports.
Yeah,
I haven't got the points for an anti-tank gun elsewhere, so I've sneaked in a Piat there. So I think that's anti-tank taken care of. Artillery, I think the one that I would highlight would be the 25-pounder. Shoots as both a light anti-tank gun and as a light howitzer.
Yeah.
So win-win. And what is it, 50 points?
55.
55 with a gun shield,
yeah.
So 55 points. It's got both those types of round, 3 men behind a gun shield. I think even taking them at veterans, so with small arms from the front, it's 6s to kill, 66 points. I think that's still a really good price for that gun.
It is, yeah, definitely. For the reasons you just said, yeah, it's just that as we add all these veteran units in terms of the veteran anti-tank rifle and the veteran light howitzer, we're kind of running out of space. But it's definitely worth thinking about taking it as veteran because you're killing on the 6 because of the gun shield. If you're taking small arms fire from the front,
yeah. I know you play a lot of veteran Brits. And I like the veteran, anything that's cheap, like the Piat or the 25 pounder. They're the ones that I like to make veteran because you get a lot more survivability for those 2 or 3 men, and it's not that many points you've spent on it. And I'll tend to make those small squads veteran and keep the big squads regular. But I believe you do the inverse a lot of the time.
Yeah, to be fair, that's because you can't take Chindits or Gurkhas or Commandos as regular. So
yeah,
my unit choices dictate, my infantry choices dictate that they are veteran, to be fair.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because sort of your theme has pushed you in that direction that you can't save the points on the main infantry squad, so you're having to save them on the teams.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Anything else in the artillery section that you think is a lot of fun or quite useful?
So, yeah, just want to highlight the Bofors, and it isn't just available to British; it's available to a lot of a lot of nations. So it's a heavy auto cannon, 60 points regular. So you're firing at +3 pen if you're firing armor piercing or the double 1-inch template if you're firing it as HE. It is on a 360 mount. So yes, it is static because it's a heavy artillery piece. You can't move it once you've deployed it or once it's come onto the board with that move that the FAQ allows. But it's very, very good at, especially if you're thinking you're going to be facing light tanks like Stuarts and Dakar Panzer IIIs and the Italian Polizei tank. It is definitely worth considering, and I have seen some very strong nations taking a heavy autocannon as a static artillery piece.
Yeah, really good. Agree with everything you've said there. You could put it back on your tow if you'd had a truck to tow it on.
Yes,
it could get back onto that and then redeploy using that method, but I imagine that would be quite a bit of faff. Could I tempt you into a controversial opinion?
Go on.
Should it have the gun shield rule?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's more often than not you see it modelled with a gun shield. You can, if you take the Rubicon one, you can build it with or without. To be honest, if it had the gun shield, I'd be even more inclined to take it because it's adding that extra survivability from small arms fire to the front.
So it sounds like historically it did have some sort of gun shield. So perhaps a 5 points upgrade to give it a gun shield would have been a good option for them to include.
Yeah, but it did. To be fair, it was also used without the gun shield, particularly if it was in its anti-aircraft role. If you're seeing it around airfields and stuff, it may well equally not have had the gun shield. But it would be nice to give it as an option. In some of the US howitzers, you can add a gun shield, can't you, for an extra 5 points? I think if that option was available for the Bofors, that would make it even more attractive.
Yeah, and I think it's a fair price to pay for it as well. I think for me that is all the units I want to highlight in artillery. The only other thing I would mention is there is an entry for the land mattress on Easy Army. Again, just highlighting this one a bit like the other ones where that isn't listed as a generic unit in the book that it's in.
Yeah.
And so if you are going to a tournament that is very specifically generic only units, it's not one that you'll automatically be allowed to run unless the TO's decided that it is in there.
Yes.
So just want to highlight, because obviously when we talk about the other nations that have a lot of multi-launchers, for me that would be an auto-include if it was a generic unit. But I'll save the discussion of multi-launchers for when they are available generically.
Yeah, you often hear that the Brits don't need anything because they've got enough as it is, and the obvious thing they don't have access to, strictly speaking, going by the wording, is that multi-launcher in the form of a land mattress in a generic platoon. But you are seeing it appearing in tournaments if the TO allows it. To be fair,
yeah, and I do prescribe to that. To be honest, that I think the Brits do have enough units to play both thematically, play competitively, and play somewhere in between, that I don't think they need the land mattress for any of those reasons. And I think really the only time I like seeing it is if you are doing something where very strictly the land mattress was being used in that engagement. And then I'd be quite happy to see it if we were recreating something where the British famously used the land mattress. But in any other case, I think the Brits don't need it. So I think I'm quite happy for it not to be included.
Sure.
Armoured cars. Now, I would quite like you to tell me about your favourite armoured car, because I'm growing quite fond of it. I haven't seen you use it.
Yes, I'm going to lay this firmly at the feet of Michael Smith, he of WTC and Beachhead.
Two mentions.
Yeah, two mentions from Mike tonight. So it's the Marmon Harrington or the Lanchester as well. It's the Lanchester's early war. The Marmon, it's technically early and mid-war. You did see it in Africa and parts of Asia as well. So it's 90 points. It's armor value 7. It's recce, and it has a dual twin turret-mounted MMG. So because it's dual, you can't split your fire between the two MMG. So you're firing at one single target with 10 shots. It's really, really useful because it is armor 7. You've obviously not got that problem that you have with, say, for example, the airborne recce Jeep, where it's only armor 6. You could split, so you could fire, fight 10 shots, so 2 lots of 5 at a unit. I really like it. I hadn't really thought about it previously, and then Mike mentioned it to me a few months ago. I tried it out, took it to the Welsh Nationals, enjoyed it. I've tried it out since then and enjoying it. I've got the Marmon Harrington rather than the Lanchester, because the Lanchester is quite a big model. It's quite long and it's also quite tall, whereas the Marmon is a bit more compact, so it's better for hiding behind things and sneaking it around the corner and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think being fully enclosed armor 7 makes it quite a bit more survivable than a soft-skinned.
Yeah.
And the twin MMGs is brutal if you could bring it to bear on something in the open.
Yes.
And having recce, there's not a huge risk in late in the turn rushing it within point blank of something, spraying it with 10 dice.
Yeah.
Because next turn, if you're at risk, you can recce away again.
100%. Yeah.
One thing, I think you said it was 90 points.
80 points.
80, yeah. I was just double checking that because, yeah, perfect. So, absolutely brilliant. Love it.
Yeah.
The one for me, one of my favourite books, Battle of France. I'm going to go back to that one. Mm-hmm. It's the early war motorcycle and sidecar. This unit is very much me. The German version of the motorcycle with sidecar, where it's got an MMG for 40 points, is really good.
Yeah.
This is basically the same thing. It's a recce motorcycle, but it's got an LMG. So it does only have 4 shots, but it's only 35 points. So for the same cost as an inexperienced MMG team, which is fixed, you wound it on a 3, you're getting a soft-skinned vehicle that can recce away. And yes, you're sacrificing a shot compared to the British MMG team, but I think to have a regular unit that can recce compared to an inexperienced unit with an extra shot, I think the motorcycle wins every single time. Mm-hmm. So immediately, very much my thing. And additionally, you can kit it out. You can replace it with an anti-tank rifle. You do pay 10 points for that, but it definitely has a use case because you could put that in outflank to get behind tanks, and then even your toughest tanks, an anti-tank rifle in the rear armour, you're threatening up to armour 10 then. And I mean, there's not a huge chance you're going to penetrate armour 10 or do any damage to it at all because you can only glance, you can't penetrate.
Yeah.
But it does mean, because you've got an anti-tank rifle on this very fast unit, you can get it into the arcs that the tank doesn't want you in, especially against Stuarts where they've got the vulnerable armour in the sides and rear.
Yeah.
Amazing. You can also give it a light mortar. There isn't a cost to do that. Not a big fan of that as an upgrade because you can't advance and fire the light mortar. You can only do that on a fire order. So it's okay. I've used that before with French, where I did a very heavy high explosive army, and I was adding that just to sort of maximise the high explosive element. For that theme, it was fun, but I wouldn't recommend it competitively. Equally, you can save points on it even further by swapping the LMG for either a rifle or an SMG, for me, yes, it's 25 points. It's really cheap, but you've taken it from something that is adequately dangerous to something that really isn't very dangerous at all, 1 or 2 shots. And so I don't think I've ever done that. I mean, what are your thoughts? Would you ever try that?
No, not in terms of SMGs or rifles, no. I will try out the motorcycle though as a unit, and it's worth saying that you have the extra selection rule, so you can take 3 of them for that single armoured car slot.
Yeah, and that's the other reason why I absolutely love it. Because with my Americans, I love running 3 inexperienced machine gun teams. So this is just the same points as that, but they're recce. It's amazing. I would highly recommend trying it for anyone who hasn't yet, because even if you're not sort of competitively minded, having 3 recce vehicles on the table is a lot of fun. Were there any other armoured cars you wanted to talk about?
Not armoured cars, no.
No, there is. The other one that I would highlight would be the PPA Jeep, which is the Jeep that has a flamethrower on. It's quite expensive. It's 68 points, but for those 68 points, you're getting a veteran soft-skinned vehicle, and it has a flamethrower on it. Now, the flamethrower is only an infantry flamethrower, so it's only a 6-inch range. So it is very vulnerable if you use it. When it first came out in the Soft Underbelly book, there was big talk of this being an amazing unit. I've seen a few people use it competitively, but I'm not sold on it as a competitive unit. I think it's too many points, and you're going to get too close. Now, having said that, the counter argument to that is the fact that it also has recce.
Yes.
And so much like what I was saying with the Marmon, where you can get right in their face and then, oh dear, next turn just recce away. You can do that. But I'd say this isn't an auto-include for sort of new players, because I think you're going to have to consider how you're using it, because even with the recce, you can't send it unsupported on its own. I think you're going to have to give it a little bit of support around it. Because otherwise someone will be able to pull off the classic double tap where they put one unit in ambush and then shoot it with the other unit so that as it recce's away, it gets ambushed. But I thought it was one worth highlighting because it is a lot of fun. It's a little bit of me.
I've been on the receiving end of it, and it was fun, not for me, but in the moment, I can see why you would take it, absolutely. And having recce does really help, because if you save it towards the end of the turn, rush it forward, try and get the shot off. If you haven't, if you don't manage to burn away what you're firing at, next turn just recce away if you need to.
Yeah, and if you do come up against it, the best counter I'd say is probably ambush, because it's soft skin, so anything can put a pin on it. If you put a pin on it, if you put 2 pins on it, it's more than 3 inches from you, it's going to be hitting on a 6. And so all it takes is a couple of sort of 5-man rifle squads, and you've basically neutralized its threat when it comes storming towards you. Obviously, what that means is you're going to have to think quite early on about, have you left yourself exposed? Do I need a second unit just to dish a pin there? But there are ways you can counter it. I just wanted to highlight that as one of the best ways I've found of countering these flamethrower units. You go in ambush, you do a pin, and then they miss their shot anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's armoured cars all nicely tied up. So we're on to, would you like to do tanks first or transports?
No, we'll do tanks because it nicely follows on from armoured cars.
Naturally. Save the best till last.
So with the tanks, what I wasn't going to do is run through the obvious ones in terms of the Stuart and Dakar Stuart and that kind of stuff. And, a lot of the British tanks, it's a bit like the Soviets, where if you can think of, a combination of light, heavy, medium, anti-tank, armor 8, armor 9, etc., there's probably a permutation out there. But there's a couple that I did want to flag up for the British. One is the M3 Lee, and we're starting to see this a little bit more in more competitive events. I've used it. I really like it. I bought one because it fits the theme in terms of Burma and that sort of stuff. But the M3 Lee is quite expensive. It's 220 points, I believe. I think for the original Grant, also the original Lee.
Yeah, the Lee is 220 for the Mark 1.
220, yeah. But the reason why I like it is you're basically getting 3 weapon systems. So you've got the hull-mounted medium anti-tank gun, which is forward-facing or right arc. That does fire a 2-inch template as an HE. You've then got the turret-mounted light anti-tank gun with the coax MMG. And then you've got a third weapon, which is another copula MMG. So you can put out three shots at 3 different units, put out 3 pins. Combination I've enjoyed using it for is the medium anti-tank gun firing with HE. So I'm firing it effectively as a lighthouse of a 2-inch template, targeting infantry or maybe soft skins, but probably infantry. The light anti-tank gun, if I need to, is firing at an armored vehicle. And then I've got that third shot through the MMG to put a pin on some infantry or maybe putting 5 shots into a soft skin vehicle.
Yeah, really good. And you're right, we are starting to see it more. Mm-hmm. I know it's one of your favourites. I was just looking at the grant there. It's 10 points less.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, maybe you could take the grant because it's got similar loadout. But what you're losing is you're losing the MMG on the turret, on the cupola.
You're losing that third weapon system. Yeah.
So actually I think that third MMG is worth the 10 points in my eyes. So I think I would always try to find the 10 points and run the Lee if I was going to. A couple of things to note with it is that it does easily catch fire. Mm-hmm. So if you get the fire result, D3 pins instead of 1 pin. And it's also got the riveted construction, so an extra +1 penetration on the rear and sides. So it is a bit vulnerable to even anti-tank rifles from the side.
Yeah.
But I suppose the idea is you put it in the middle and keep it supported on the sides. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm not going to push it forward. I'm going to keep it, either in the middle, or because of the hull-mounted medium anti-tank gun, which is firing forward or the right arc, I'm going to position it so that I'm covering the right side of the board with that tank. You can pay extra. So if you get the M3A3 Lee or the M3A5 Grant, you can actually cancel out the easily catches fire and the vulnerable, depending on which combination you go for. But it does start to get expensive. It's 220 with those 2 things. You're getting up to like 250 points when you start cancelling out the other bits and pieces.
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth just sort of taking the risk than to save the points.
Yeah.
And I think the reason we are starting to see them more is because of the prevalence of the Stuart.
Yes.
They're a bit unavoidable at competitive tournaments.
Yeah.
To the point where and this is my personal opinion, but I am starting to get a bit bored of them. Just because when I go to a tournament, I like to see all the different armies. And I'm just getting a bit bored of seeing the Stuart turning up in every list. I like when people are bringing things like the Lee, or if someone brings a Grant, or I mean the big thing with the Lee as well, because we talked about why it's good in the game, it also just looks really cool, I think.
Yeah, it's a bit of an ugly duckling, isn't it, to be fair?
Yeah, but on that note, I think it's probably worth just taking a slight detour to talk about why people are taking the Stuart, just in case anyone new is listening, because you often hear it called the Dakar Stuart.
Yeah.
And the reason we're calling it that is, and I believe that's the etymology of the Dakar Stuart is from 40k, where the orcs put out loads of shots.
Dakar orcs.
Dakar. Yeah. Because essentially, you're paying 115 points for the tank basic with a machine gun in the hull and a machine gun in the coax. And then for only 15 extra points, you can add 2 light machine guns to the hull. And so you've now got, from the hull, you've got 8 shots from the light machine guns, 5 shots from the MMG, so that's 13 shots from the hull, and then an extra 5 shots, machine gun shots, from the coax on the turret. So that's 18 shots, which obviously is a lot of shots. So if you're up against an infantry squad in the open, it's going to wreck them. But the big benefit of it, why people really like it, is because it still has that light anti-tank gun. So if someone brings a Stuart to counter your Stuart, then you can have a bit of a tank battle as well. Whereas a lot like the Marmon, yes, it's got lots of shots, but if it comes up against a tank, it can't counter it.
Yeah.
And so that's why the Stuart is really popular. I don't think we need to dwell on it too much. The one thing I would note with the British version is it can only have recce if you take the turret off.
Yes.
And that is a mistake that I've seen happen at tournaments where someone goes to recce their British Stuart, and it's just one thing to be aware of, that if you see someone wrecking a Stuart, if it's British, it shouldn't have a turret. So again, if you weren't paying attention to at the beginning of the game, if you're rushing to set up, if it's British and it's got a turret, you know that it doesn't have recce.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pro tip for you there. You can take a pintle as well. I mean, generally as a conversation, what do you think of pintle-mounted machine guns?
I don't take them, mainly because I'm trying to find points with my veteran-heavy infantry. I can see why you might. It's another weapon system. You can put out another pin elsewhere, all that kind of stuff. But obviously, you're running the risk of making yourself open top. So if you are taking a pintle-mounted, your vehicle with a pintle mount, you're going to be using it towards the end of the turn to minimise how many shots the enemy can get at you if you're open topped.
Yeah, I remember when the Stuarts first started to become a big thing. When you added the pintle, it gave you 23 shots. Mm-hmm. And so I remember a lot of the conversation being, I'm going to take the pintle as well, put out 23 shots, and I'm going to use it as my last dice. And then I think that tactic, people realised, you're trying to use it early turn to force units down, to really dominate the turn.
Yeah.
And so they realised that actually the pintle isn't worth the points.
Yeah.
The only time it's worth the points is on the recce version, because you're open-topped anyway, so shooting the pintle weapon doesn't cost you.
That doesn't make you more vulnerable. Yeah.
But on the flip side of that, the recce version does have an HMG, which only gives you 3 shots. Admittedly, you got a +1 pen, but it's only 3 shots rather than the 5. Mm-hmm. It's actually quite reasonably priced, to be fair, because it's only 90 points for a Hull MMG, a Pintle HMG, and you've got recce. And then, of course, you can still add those 2 LMGs for 15 points. So actually, for 105 points, it's not bad. But I think the reason you never see it is because even though it is still very reasonably priced, the open topped really does cripple it.
It's also because it's taking up the tank slot, isn't it? So,
and you could be filling that with a normal Stuart with an anti-tank gun.
Yeah.
All right, having said we weren't going to talk about it too much, I think that's probably enough then of the Stuart for one day. What was the next tank you want to talk about?
So it's more a collection of vehicles that fit in the tank slot, and that's the anti-aircraft vehicles, which you're taking with heavy autocannon or maybe a light autocannon with the potential for taking up to 4. And I've started to see it more often, and I've certainly looked into it myself. And the reason why you start to see it more often, certainly at more competitive events, is it's that anti-Stuart counter. So if you've got a heavy autocannon with a +3 pen, that's more than sufficient to be threatening and pushing away those Stuarts.
Yeah, absolutely. And being universal weapons as well, where you can do the anti-tank round or the HE round for potential extra pins, they are a great weapon system. And so anything like that, the Bofors on the truck is definitely my favourite in that category, because I think it's 60 points for a Bofors on the back of a truck.
Yeah, 60 points regular for a heavy autocannon with 360 fire on a soft skin vehicle.
Yeah, I love it. On that note, on light vehicles in the tank slot, I do love the 2-pounder Porty.
Okay.
65 points, light anti-tank gun on the back of a 6+ soft skin. The benefit of this one so I run the Dodge version in my American list. That one has a light anti-tank gun on the back. It can't shoot forwards, so already you've got a benefit with this one. And the other big benefit of the British version is that you can add a Pintle MMG for 15 points, which means that if there isn't a tank for you to be shooting at, you've got the machine gun, and you can use your light anti-tank as a 1-inch template to maybe put out 2 pins. So you could potentially be putting out 3 pins to two different squads in one turn with this one, and that would cost you about 80 points, which I think very reasonably priced.
Yep.
Especially if you're using it to counter Stuart, because you paid less points than they've paid for the Stuart.
Yes.
And so it means you've got an extra 50 points to spend somewhere else on maybe, I don't know, a Piat.
Yeah. I think if I was playing it in a tournament that allowed dual platoons or any number of platoons, I am going to be looking more at those AA guns on a truck, for example, or something like the Crusader, which is an armored vehicle with AA guns. If it's a single platoon, it's very unlikely that I'm going to take a soft skin or an armored vehicle just with an AA gun, because I'm probably going to take the Stuart of the Dakar variety, because I'm that kind of person.
Yeah, I think competitively, I'm probably going to take the Porty, because I'm gonna play that game where yes, I don't have a Stuart, but I've paid less points. And so I'm going to have an extra order dice, hopefully, so that So what I'm thinking is I'll get to go earlier in the turn and hopefully get the shot off on your Stuart before you get all those machine guns against my soft skin. So I think that's the gamble I'm going to play if we're doing Brits against Brits competitively. The other category I wanted to highlight was, I was going to highlight a specific one, but actually the Churchills in general, I absolutely love.
Okay.
Just because they are an absolutely classic World War II tank.
Yeah, sure.
They do suffer from what you were talking about with the mortar fire, because I think the model itself must be about 6 inches long.
Yeah, it's
and it
massive,
can only move 6 inches on the advance because it's slow.
Yeah.
And so this is the classic, not being able to get out of mortar fire range, but equally, it's armor 10.
Yeah.
And so even a heavy mortar on the top armor can only do superficial damage on a 6. And so it's more annoyed by the pins, I think. The AVRE, I really like. That one's got a heavy howitzer. It's got the petard mortar. I presume I'm pronouncing that wrong. But what that one is, that's the one where it's a 4-inch template and it can't fire at long range. And so it's limited to 36 inches. It means it can't indirectly fire. It was used for busting bunkers, I think, on D-Day.
Yeah.
Again, I think that's another spigot mortar, much like the Piat and the Blacker Bombard. So yeah, love that one. The Crocodile.
Yeah.
Love that. I was going to talk about the flame tanks as a category in their own right, much like the AA tanks.
Okay.
But the Crocodile is worth noting because you're never going to run it competitively because it's 480 points regular.
Yeah.
And it's slow, so you're never going to get the flamethrower within range. But it is armor 11, and it's got a flamethrower on the hull, which means it keeps its medium anti-tank gun on the turret with a coax MMG.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you're never going to get the flamethrower in range, but at least you can shoot at tanks in the meantime. I have played against one of these, and I spent 4 turns firing my heavy mortar at it, trying to range in, because obviously it was just advancing, and I could keep ranging in.
Yeah.
And then I think turn 4 or 5, I finally hit it, was obviously very happy, until I realised it's armor 11 and I couldn't hurt it anyway.
It shrugs off the pins, yeah.
Yeah, and so and I didn't even pin it, and so the whole thing was just a waste of a heavy mortar for a game, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't, because the person had spent half their points on one tank, it wasn't game changing, but I did feel like a bit of a fool. So in terms of tanks with flamethrowers that I would actually run, there's one that I've run before with the Brit, which is the Wasp.
Okay.
And I do love the Wasp. I love a Bren carrier, and the Wasp is basically a Bren carrier with a flamethrower, 100 points, and you get to upgrade it for 10 points to have a light machine gun. You need to be careful though, because it's only a forward-facing pintle on the Wasp, so just be aware of that. Both of your weapons are front arc only, but 110 points, you're getting an armoured vehicle with a flamethrower and a light machine gun. The only thing I don't like is it's open-topped, which means their riflemen are going to pin it, and it's never going to hit with the flamethrower.
Sure.
But it is, again, it's a lot of fun, and I love it.
The reason why I was non-committal going at that point is you can run a Stuart, not the Dakar version, but you can run a Stuart with the light anti-tank gun in the turret and a hull-mounted forward-facing flamethrower.
Yes, but it's 40 points upgrade, I believe.
It is, yeah. It's in the FAQ, and it applies to Armies of US and Armies of UK. Yeah.
Yeah, not really worth it, I would say, that one.
Yeah, I have taken it, and it was good fun. You are normally hitting on a 4, if not a 5, because movement penalty and then long range and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and just one more thing to note there. The points that I was quoting there are for the Wasp Mark IIC, I believe. Oh, I've just had a quick look. Both entries are called Wasp 2C.
Okay.
But the one in the D-Day book has different weapon loadout. So it comes with the flamethrower, it comes with a Pintle MMG, and it comes with a light mortar. So you've actually got 3 weapons on that one.
Yeah.
But you are paying 30 points extra. So you're paying 140 points. But otherwise, it's very much similar. It can have extra armour, the one in the D-Day book as well, to make an armour 8. But it's still open-topped. And to be honest, it's the open-topped that is a bigger problem than the lack of armour. So I'd say one to try if you love flamethrowers like me. But I would say don't include it if you are trying to build as competitive a list as possible, would be my advice. Were there any other British tanks you want to talk about? Because a lot of the ones that are left are American tanks. And I know we're going to do an episode on the American Army soon. So it might be worth sort of, maybe as if we say, there's lots of American tanks available.
Yeah. Other tanks are available. Yeah.
Yeah, other tanks are available. See future episode on American Army to find out which ones. Much like the rest of the British Army list, there's so many options that whether you're a historical gamer or you're sort of just a casual for fun gamer or whether you're a very competitive gamer, there's a tank for you in the British Army list. So we'll be here all night if we try to list them all. So I think, shall we move on to my favourite section, which is the transport section? Fabulous. So Phil, what's your favourite transport?
So I'm going to pick out 2, although technically 3, but it's one of them's very similar. So I love the 3-ton truck for the Brits. It's up to 12 men. You can shove an MMG on it for plus 15 points. So for 54 points, you're getting a 12-man transport with an MMG. The reason why I really like it is, and it's particularly relevant to armor platoons. You pay your 39 points for your regular truck. You then pay an additional 34 points and upgrade it to a Bedford QLT, and you can then fit 29 men in that truck. and the reason why this is relevant is if you're playing an armor platoon where you have to have transport for all of your infantry and artillery and so on, if you've got under 20 or 29 or fewer men, you just need that one truck.
Amazing.
Shove an MMG on it, and it's a mobile MMG platform. All of your men have that transport capacity. You're not going to put them in there in case it gets blown up and they all go down and dismount and so on. But you've covered it in terms of the requirements of the list. Yeah,
exactly. Worth highlighting. You don't have to deploy them in there. So if you take a commando force, is there a commando armoured platoon?
There's not a commando armoured platoon, no, sadly not.
Oh. No. But something of that ilk where you've got veterans and all your team weapons, and you're planning to run it on foot. Amazing to just be able to put. Or equally, you could go absolutely crazy, actually put everything in there, and then race up the board. Fantastic. Yeah, I was wondering when you started talking about 12-man capacity truck, why you'd brought it up until you mentioned that last bit there.
Yeah.
So that was your first one. What was your second one that you really liked?
So the second one, it would be remiss not to mention it. So it's the Bren carrier. You see it all the time, particularly of engineers, and you hear them referred to as Brengineers, Bren's engineers in the Brens and so on. 60 points for a regular Bren carrier. You pay an extra 10 points to have that Pintle LMG, so you can put 2 pins out, split fire. The reason for mentioning it is, and I've done this quite effectively, is for an additional 10 points. So 60 points for your regular Bren carrier, pay another 10 points to put your Bren, your LMG as a pin tool. The further 10 points, you can swap the whole mounted LMG for an anti-tank rifle. So you can effectively have a 5-man Armour 7 open-topped transport with a Pintle LMG. But because you've got the anti-tank rifle in the hull, you can then threaten armoured vehicles as you're advancing your engineers up in your Bren.
Yeah, and I think my 2 thoughts on that are, first of all, if you took like a few of these with anti-tank rifles, amazing. If you haven't got much other anti-tank, really good if someone's brought something like a Stuart with armour 8. Even if you don't do any damage, you could potentially put 3 pins a turn out, which would stop that tank in its tracks.
Yeah.
And my other thought on that is this is a really good use for your forward artillery observer. Once he's done his fire order and put the marker down, I see a lot of people using him to get into the Bren to fire the second weapon. So those are my 2 thoughts on it. It is an absolute classic.
Yeah.
And when I started Brits, it was the thing that I wanted more than anything, just because it is really cool to have the little Brens pushing up the board. What I've found recently, controversially, is that actually I think if I'm going competitive, I'm going to swap the Brens out for a different transport. And that one is the India pattern armoured carrier.
Yeah.
Because effectively it's a Bren, so it's got all those options you've just said. Same armour, still open top, still 5 men, but it's wheeled instead of tracked. And so you're getting an extra 3 inches on the advance, 6 inches on the run, because it's now 12.24.
Yeah.
And you're getting an extra turn in each of them. And what I've found with my Brens is sometimes they're just not quite fast enough or manoeuvrable enough. And so I think what I'm going to do in the future is try the India pattern armoured carrier. Because obviously, yes, it's faster, which is a huge perk, but what you do lose is the trick that I believe Bo Mortensen on YouTube was the first to really sort of put this out on the internet, where you put your Bren behind dense terrain, and normally your transports with the wheels can't go through it, but the turn it's behind, it can't be shot, but because it's tracked, it can then just plough through that dense terrain. And a lot of people, because most transports are wheeled and can't go through the dense, you'll often catch people out with that as well. So that's the Bren's real strength, but its weakness is it's not as manoeuvrable as the India pattern. And so I think I'm going to try the India pattern, because I've tried the Bren quite extensively now, and I do still love it, but there have been times when I've thought, if this was a truck or something similar, I'd really benefit from the extra manoeuvrability.
Yeah, I like the Bren for that reason. You put it behind dense terrain, behind the woods or behind a ruin, and depending on if the opponent is up to speed or maybe not paying attention, you can then just push it through, unexpected, out pops your engineers, and off you go. I do like the fact that the Indian pattern carrier has got that additional range, and I can absolutely see a situation where if you've got 2 or 3 of them on an outflank with engineers in, you've got that 12-inch move rather than the 9, that 6-inch move for the engineers popping out, and then 6 inches for the flamethrower. You're already into the middle of the board. Well, not middle of the board, so you're 2 foot in. So you're a third of the way into a 6 foot wide board with that 24-inch.
Yeah, and the only thing, thinking about the outflank there, the one of the things the Bren does have in its favour is if there's an obstacle or dense terrain on the flank right up against the board edge, it doesn't restrict the Bren coming in, whereas it would stop the India pattern coming in at that point. So there have been times when I've held off an outflank for 1 turn longer than I could have. So they've come in, let's say, turn 4 instead of turn 3, and it's been because there's a house or there's a wall or there's a forest exactly halfway up the table, as far as I can reckon. And so I've had to wait till turn 4 so that I safely knew that my wheeled vehicle could get around that obstacle. That's where the Bren has a slight advantage, because if there is a wall halfway up the table, right at the table edge, it doesn't really affect the Bren. You can still advance on.
Yeah.
What was your third one you wanted to highlight in the transport section?
Well, it was actually the Indian pattern carrier, because it was
fabulous.
Effectively the Bren, but with a slightly longer reach.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, there's 2 that I wanted to highlight, in addition to your 3 there, even though I did steal one of yours, so I suppose technically 3. So the first one I wanted to highlight was one we talked about previously, so we won't talk too long on it, but I think I'd be remiss not to mention it, which is the Buffalo.
Yeah.
So this is an American transport from the Lend-Lease. It can carry 30 men, a Jeep or a Bren carrier, or up to medium artillery. You're not going to put artillery in this, I think. I think if you've spent 123 points to tow an artillery piece with this, you're probably not quite doing it right. The way I do it is, again, if you're doing an armoured platoon, this is a great choice because it's armour 7, it's got 2 MMGs. You don't have to deploy all the infantry in it, but what it means is you're not having to buy lots of trucks for your infantry.
Yep.
But the reason I really like it is because you can put a Bren carrier in it. And I did talk about this last episode, but I'll just, for anyone who hasn't listened to that, what I like to do with this is I like to put something like engineers in the Bren, the Bren in the Buffalo, and then the Buffalo goes 9, the Bren goes 9, obviously both shooting their machine guns as they go, and then the engineers get out 6 and then either flamethrower something, or if I've given them SMGs, they'll use their SMGs instead, but they're now point blank. And yeah, it's just a load of fun because you're putting out loads of pins. You've got this ridiculous transport, because the Buffalo is massive on the table. And it's also a lot of fun because it is a very high-risk strategy, because you're gambling on getting 3 dice in a row. Because if you don't, and then their light anti-tank gun swings onto that Buffalo, it's going to get wrecked straight away. Because it's not. It's armor 7, so as soon as it gets hit, it's going to fall apart. And yeah, so I wanted to highlight that one because it is a really fun one. Again, not competitive just because of the points value. And it has got other options as well, which sort of a light autocannon you can put on it, or you can add more machine guns to it. I think if you're doing that, you're really leaning into it, and you're going to get to the point of like, you're going to get sort of 250 points where you're competing with tanks. But if that's your thing, like, I'd love to see it. And then the other one that I wanted to highlight, well, it's 2 here. You've got the kangaroos, basically, the ram kangaroo and the priest kangaroo, which are the Sherman and priest tanks, where they've removed the turret to use them as a transport. So the Sherman version can carry 11. It's 127 points. I don't run the Sherman version. I've actually got 2 of the priest version because they're 87 points, which is still quite steep, but they're armor 8 and they carry 11 men. So it's a hardy transport, and you can put a machine gun on it as well for 10 points. So for 97 points, just shy of 100, you're getting an 11-man transport that's armor 8. Pretty good. I mean, it's a lot of fun. Again, not super competitive, but I do really enjoy running it. And I'll quite often put, if my officer's on his own, you could put 10 men plus your officer, or 2 5-men. Say I'm running commandos, I'll have 2 5-man commando squads, and then maybe it's the officer, because the priest is going to get pinned because it's open topped. And so having the officer in there really does help you to keep advancing forwards, because also it helps the men get out, because while he's in the transport, he also boosts their leadership as well. So yeah, those were the ones that I really wanted to highlight, because they're the ones that I think are probably the most fun, even though they're probably the least competitive. The one that I wanted to ask you about was, have you used the OP transports before?
No. So this is, you can take vehicles, can't you, to put your artillery observer in, and it becomes effectively a mobile artillery observer, but you can issue the fire order from the vehicle. Yeah,
exactly. That's in one. Perfect.
Thank you. No, I haven't. It's in the D-Day books, isn't it?
It is, the British and Canadian sectors, I believe. Really interesting. I was really hoping you had tried them at some point, because they've piqued my interest.
Okay.
Just because, again, I don't think it's going to be a competitive thing. We're going to see at lots of tournaments, but it is something that I think is a lot of fun. I think the last time I looked at it, the thing that put me off was the fact that it can only carry your observer and you can't use it to transport anything else.
Correct,
And I mean, it's 100, they're going to be about 100 points basically, because they're essentially the bit like the kangaroos, where they're based on the tank version, and so they're about 100 points each, I think.
You're paying for the vehicle, and you're paying for the artillery observer, so it does start to add up.
The only one that I think if I do try one, I'm going to try the Otter, because it's only armor 7, it's 60 points, it's got an LMG, and it's got that neat little trick where you can put the observer in it. I mean, another interesting point on that actually is, if you've put your observer in there, if you are playing something like double envelopment or sectors, it's made them a lot more maneuverable to go and try and get 3 points for you.
Yes, and obviously because it's 2 units, it's going to count as double.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be 6 points if you get them up there with it in there. Obviously, it is high risk, because if it does get wrecked, the D6 hits are going on a unit that's very small, and so there's a good chance if it gets wrecked that you're going to lose both. But I mean, it's certainly an interesting one that I'd love to see somebody play. Because also, interestingly, the Otter does have recce, and so what you could do is you could deploy it really sort of, because one of the things with your observer is he needs that line of sight to put the dice down. So you could place the Otter quite aggressively for the line of sight, and then you could risk sort of putting it in that position, because if it does get shot at, it can wreck you away, and your observer hasn't been killed, and next turn he can have a go at the fire order.
I'm quite interested now trying it out, to be fair.
Yeah, I think definitely at some point I'm going to have to try it myself or find someone who has tried it to play against, because it's one of those ones, much like what I was saying in the last episode, where when I'm building lists, I'm looking, I like the quirky things and sort of to push things to the limit. And I think having a armoured platoon where you've got the observer in his own transport, it's very much pushing that armoured theme to the limit, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's everything for the Brits that we wanted to cover. Obviously, there's a ton more units that we didn't mention. I think we'd be here another 3 days if we talked about every single unit that's available to them.
And I think just on that note, I know when I started playing Brits and I got the Armies of GB book and I started reading through it, I was like, there are so many different options here. And I went for, and my initial choices were based on what models were available, what models have I heard of, in terms of which tank, which armor car, that sort of thing. But actually, if you spend a bit of time just reading through the book and looking at the descriptions, you can get the statistics off, Easy Army in terms of how much they cost and what they run, but start reading the book and having a look at the descriptions, you can get a better idea. And there are more and more options now available in terms of picking up the models. Warlords, to be fair, does have a lot of these more obscure models as resin. But with 3D printing, people like Mad Bob and Paint and Glue and those kind of things, you can get these weird and wacky vehicles that aren't commonly available quite easily now.
Yeah, 100%. I think if you are starting the British Army, what I'd probably recommend is, if you're doing it sort of for fun, I would just look at all the tanks that are available and find the one you like the look of.
Yeah. And
then I would build my army around that. And because if I'm going the competitive end, I think we know what that list is going to look like. It's going to look like Para-Gurkhas or Commandos if you're going slightly less. And then I would encourage people, if you are doing competitive, to try the lighter, the cheaper units in the tank slot, like the anti-aircraft guns and the
Porty,
and the Porty, because I think that really does have a place. And I think the reason we're not seeing it yet is because the Stuart very much is a victim of its own success. It gets talked about so much that everyone sort of thinks that it's such an auto-include, you'd be foolish not to. But actually, I think you could fill that role with other units, because you could have the Marmon and your Porty for the same price as the Stuart, and now you've got 2 order dice instead of 1. And actually, there's the Vickers in there that's got 2 machine guns and 2 turrets for about the same as the Marmon as well. And so there are other options available that are just as competitive, I'd say, if used in synergy with the rest of your list. Because you are saving points by not having your Stuarts. And I know you were saying this where when you were doing dual platoon lists, you were starting to wonder if the price of the Stuarts was starting to become less competitive if you took 2 of them.
Yeah, so looking at events coming up where the dual platoon is available, the sort of default mindset that I went into it was like, oh, okay, I'm going to take 2 Stuarts because I can. And then, that's 300 points or whatever. And it's like, okay, I've just rinsed, a third of my list, if it's 1,000 points, on two tanks. If I then start adding in vets, I'm seriously running out of points in terms of the amount of dice. So I have kind of looked at it again going, actually, just because I can take 2 Stuarts, it doesn't mean that I should. Other tanks are available. There are other options out there. And I think you just looking at it in a slightly broader way rather than that, that route that's expected. That's probably the best way of saying it.
Yeah, because it's 130 points for 1 Stuart, so it's going to be, if it's 1,000 point limit and you've took 2, that's 26% of your army. And you can have 2 Porties for 130 points. And so actually, if you can use the 2 Porties for your anti-tank roll and then find something else to use for your anti-infantry roll, because now you've got basically 130 points to play with, that's 2 squads of 5-man veterans. It certainly does give you options, taking the cheaper option. So if you do want to play those veteran lists, maybe the Stuart isn't the tank for you. And I would love to start seeing people coming through at the top end of tournaments not using the Stuarts, because at the Welsh Nationals and the Battle of Britain, we did see a lot of British Stuarts coming in the top 5. And I do think part of that is, yes, it's brilliant, but I do think a huge part of that is the fact that the good players think it's brilliant. And so the good players are going to include it most of the time. But of course, they're the good players, so they're going to win their games most of the time as well. And so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yeah.
And so I would like to start seeing them come through, because I have seen lists where people have taken the classic sort of 2 Stuart and not do sort of as well as we were expecting them.
Oh, yeah. Just because you've got a list that's got, some Stuarts, some Gurkha Powerers, some Engineers and Brain Carriers, if you don't know how to play the list, and or you haven't played the list before, like you've gone to an event and you've taken the list that you expect to be strong, and it is strong. If you haven't practiced with it and worked out how the units interact and so on, you are going to struggle.
Yeah,
no matter how good the units are.
Absolutely. And so what that tells me is, in addition to what you've just said about making like the player being the most important part, because they need to know how to use the list, it also tells me that because the players who aren't as practiced with their list aren't automatically winning just because they've took Stuarts, it tells me that actually it's not an absolute auto-include. And so for my sake, I would really appreciate if you wouldn't, just so I could see something different, please. Fantastic. Well, was there anything else you'd like to discuss, Phil?
There probably is loads, but I think we have rambled on enough for one episode.
So I think all I have to say now is thank you to everyone who is listening. Thank you for people who've given feedback, both positive and negative. To be honest, if you have something specific that you think we should cover, or if the feedback we've got about things we've said that have made us think is just as valuable as people sort of boosting the podcast by leaving comments and things, which helps other people to find it. So we appreciate all the feedback and any sort of interaction.
Like, share, subscribe, do all the things that you do. And thanks again. And ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.